We begin today the Gemara on Daf Lamed Vav Amud Beis, 5 lines up from the bottom of the Amud, where it says Amar Rabbi Shmuel. So it said in the Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Shmuel Bamed Dvarim Amurim B'Zdei Alavan, the halachas of the chazakah that has to be 3 years. So Rabbi Shmuel says if it's a field that relies on the rain and it only grows one season a year, so then you can establish your chazakah over a span of 18 months. Then Rabbi Shmuel in the Mishnah goes on to say, if you have an orchard and there are grapes, there's olives and there's figs, so because you have 3 different kinds of trees in the same field, so you can establish a chazakah basically in one season. First you pick the grapes, and then you pick the olives, and then the figs, and that's it. That's your chazakah. You did 3 different things, 3 different kinds of trees, even though it's all in one season, and there's no macha. That combines to be 3 different things that establish a chazakah. That's Rabbi Shmuel. Now the Gemara brought before that Shmuel said that the Chachamim argue on this. You can't, since this is all in 1 year, in one season, it's not going to be a chazakah. You're going to have to establish a chazakah by eating the grapes in 3 different years, 3 different seasons, or the olives in 3 different seasons. You can't do one after the other because it's different trees in 1 year and 1 season. Okay, that's the machlokes the Gemara brought before, which is relevant for the continuation of the Gemara here. Now, Amar Abaye. So Abaye said, Mid Rabbi Shmuel nishma l'Rabbanan. From what Rabbi Shmuel said, that you can eat from grapes and that counts as a chazakah, at 1 year of a chazakah, and then the figs, each one separately counts as a chazakah. From what Rabbi Shmuel said, we could also understand, according to the opinion of the Rabbanon, even though the Rabbanon disagree and say that there has to be 3 different years, but nevertheless there's a certain halacha from what Rabbi Shmuel said that we can now also learn out and apply to the opinion of the Rabbanon. What is that halacha? If a person has 30 trees planted in an orchard, and these 30 trees are spread out in 3 areas of a beisah, which means that in every beisah there's 10 trees planted. We had this already before in Perich Lo Yachbar, that when you plant trees in an orchard, so the size of a beisah, which is 50 by 50 amas, if you have 10 trees planted in that area, that's the proper amount of trees that are spread out. They're not too densely close to each other, and it's not too spread out and far from each other. That's the right amount of trees in an area. The Rashbamir says if you have trees that are closer than this, so then it becomes like a forest. It's not planted properly for an orchard. If it's a place that it's more spread out than this, so then you're just wasting space. You're not using it properly. So therefore it says when you have this orchard and you have these 30 trees that are spread out in these 3 beisah. Now, what happened is, this person that wants to establish a chazakah, achal asara b'shanazu, he ate from 10 trees in the first year, v'asara b'shanazu, and from another 10 trees in the next year, and v'asara b'shanazu, and from another 10 trees in the 3rd year. But he didn't eat from all 30 trees all in 1 year. Hareizu chazakah. He can establish by this a chazakah on this entire area, on the entire property of the 3 beisah that has these 30 trees in them. Okay, now this is, as the Gemara will explain here, this is based on what Rabbi Shmuel said, and we can learn from there even to the Rabbanon. And the Gemara will explain now exactly how and when this applies, because simply it's hard to understand. This person didn't establish a full chazakah on the entire property. He's only eating a certain percent each year. Why should we combine and say that after 3 years he was machzik, that he used and he ate from the entire property? So the Gemara explains, Lav mi amar Rabbi Shmuel, isn't it true that Rabbi Shmuel said, Chad peire have a chazakah, that if you eat in an orchard where you have the grapes and the olives and the figs, that if you eat from one peire, if you eat just grapes, so that counts as 1 year of a chazakah. And then if you eat the next year the olives and then dates and then figs, each one separately can be like a full chazakah, for a full year of a chazakah. So if so again, chad peira of a chazakah l'kula peira, one peira that you eat, one kind of peira that you eat is a chazakah for all the rest of the peiros of that field. So hachanami, here in this case, when you have the 30 trees that are spread out in these 3 beisah, hani have a chazakah lahani, v'hani have a chazakah lahani. The fact that 1 year, in one season, you're eating from 10 trees, and the next season, the next year, you're eating from another 10 trees, and the 3rd year, you're eating from another 10 trees, you don't have to be machzik in the entire property. Rabbi Shmuel is making this point, that a chazakah for 1 year doesn't have to be in the entire property, it could be just in the grapes. So here as well, when you have the 10 trees, in one Beisah, another 10 in another Beisah, another 10 in another Beisah, and it's one big area of 30 trees, you don't have to make a chazakah in the entire area. From 10 trees is considered to be one season for 1 year, and another 10 from another season, another year, and so on. Now, so the Rashbam explains that this is true even according to the Rabbanan. Why? Because the only reason that Rabbanan argued in Rabbi Shmuel is because Rabbi Shmuel was mechadish that you can establish the chazakah in 1 year, in one season, over a span of a couple of months, where you're eating from the grapes, and then the olives, and then the figs. On that the Rabbanan argued. The Rabbanan say it has to be over 3 different years. So over here though, the Rabbanan would agree to this, because this is over 3 different years. He's eating from 10 trees in 1 year, next year from another 10 trees, and from the next year another 10 trees. As long as it's in 3 different years, the Rabbanan would agree to this. The only prat the Rabbanan argued on is that it can't be in the same year. But the fact that it doesn't have to be that you're machzik in every single area of the property, that point the Chachamim agreed to. Okay, but now though, the Gemara gives 2 limitations to when we apply this halacha, because it's still hard to understand why, if I'm only being machzik in one portion of the property, can I establish a chazakah on everything? You left out another part of the property, so that should be a chazakah on everything. So the Gemara explains, when is this true? That's if you made a chazakah on 10 of the trees and not on the others, because the others didn't produce fruits yet. It was only 10 in this season that produced, and then in the next year there was another 10 trees that produced fruits, and then in the third year another 10 trees. So then if you're eating from only those 10 trees that were the only ones that produced, then it'll be a chazakah. But let's say if other trees, or if all 30 trees produced fruits, and you're just eating from 10 of them, well, have you chazakah? So then you can't say it's a chazakah on the entire property. Adarabah, you see that this person is not eating at all. He's eating just a portion, and then another year another portion of it. So then it shows that he's not using this orchard here properly. So then it's not a chazakah. The Marakama says, I didn't protest against this person because he was just like a ganev coming here, and he wasn't eating properly from this. Now the Rashbam brings from Rabbeinu Hananel what kind of trees are this, if they're all the same kind of trees. So what kind of trees are this? That there are some that are ripe and there's some that are not. So he says there's a tree called Benois Shuach, which I think is a kind of palm tree where it takes 3 years until it ripens. So if you have trees that were planted earlier and they ripen in 1 year, and then there's other trees that ripen the next year, and then there's other trees that only ripen 3 years later. So then it's possible that this should be the case. Another limitation the Gemara says that if you only ate from 10 trees, and then the next year another 10, next year another 10, that it could be a chazakah for the entire area. The bazi bazuzi. This is only if the trees that you ate from is spread around in the whole area. Meaning if there's a row of 10 trees in one beisah, on one area of a beisah, and then there's another beisah next to it, and a third beisah next to it, and these are 3 different areas of trees near each other. And you're just eating in 1 year from one beisah and the 10 trees that are in that beisah. Then you can't say that it's going to be a chazakah on the entire area, because then I consider that area to be like a separate field, separate orchard. But if there are 10 trees that are spread around in the entire area of these 30 trees, dispersed, and you're eating from those 10 trees that are ripe in this season, and then another 10 trees that are dispersed in the next season, and another 10 in the next season, then it'll be a chazakah. Okay, the Gemara goes on to a different Indian here. Zeh hichzik bi'lonois. What is this talking about? So here, this term hichzik here is different than the lashon of chazakah that we're discussing till here in the Perek. The lashon chazakah that we're talking about till here is a person to be in a field for 3 years that creates a presumptive status that he is the owner. Here, the lashon of hichzik means the act that's done to create a kinyan, to acquire the property. A chazakah to acquire a property would be Rafak Bei Porta, for example. If you dig in the field, you do something to when you fix it, or you put up a fence, you do something in the field, that is an act of a kinyan, to acquire. And what this Gemara is talking about is somebody that's selling his property that he has with the trees. That's the only reason why this comes up here. We were speaking about a property with trees, so the Gemara brings this halach, even though it's not related really. But a person has a property with trees, and he's selling to one person the actual property itself, the ground itself, and to someone else, he's selling the trees. Okay, so now what happens? Zeh hichzik bi'lonois. So the one that's buying the trees, he did an action of a chazakah, something to fix in the tree itself, and therefore he acquired the trees. And v'zeh hichzik bekarka. And the other buyer, he's buying the actual ground itself, he made a chazakah in the karka itself. So the question now is, how do we exactly divide the rights between these two people? The one that owns the ground and the other one that owns the trees. Amar Rav Zvid, so Rav Zvid says, we divide it 100% that Zeh Kana Ilonis, the one that acquired the trees, he only has the trees. He has no rights in the ground, in the field, anything around the trees at all. He only has the trees. And Vizeh Kana Karka. And the other one has the rights to the karka. The entire karka is his. Okay, that's the chiddush over here of what Rav Zvid is saying. So the Rashbam here brings that there is a Mishnah later that says that if a person buys from someone 3 trees in his field, if someone sells you 3 trees in his field, and he's not selling you the field itself, but because you bought 3 trees and you need space in the ground in order to do the work for your trees and for picking the fruits or whatever it is, so you automatically get ownership in a certain space of field around the trees that you bought. That's when a person is selling you trees. But in this case, when there are 2 buyers and one bought the field and the other one bought the trees, says Rav Zvid, that does not apply. In this case, we say the one that gets the field itself gets it fully, and the one that gets the trees gets just the trees. Okay, that's the chiddush of Rav Zvid over here. Now on this, Maskeflor Rav Papa. So Rav Papa asks him, if that's the case, it comes out, so the one that owns the trees has nothing in the field at all. And if so, let the owner of the field say to the owner of the trees, uproot you trees, take them and leave from here. This karka is totally mine. Now, the Rashbam's pshat in this Gemara is that what Rav Papa is saying is, not that the owner of the field could tell the owner of the trees, while the trees are still growing and are producing fruits, that take your trees out of here and leave. It doesn't work that way. As long as the trees are still taking nourishment from the ground and they're growing fruits, so then obviously when he was sold these trees, he has the right to have these trees here. He was sold living trees that can take nourishment from the ground. You can't just tell him, uproot your trees and leave from here. But what Rav Papa is saying is, when these trees will dry up and they won't produce fruits anymore, and they're just taking up space in the property, so the owner of the trees, they will have to take away his trees from here. And he can't uproot these trees and now go and plant other trees in that space where the first trees were, because you don't have a right in the field at all. The original trees that you had here were yours, but when they dry up, then you have to take your trees away. That should be the halacha. This is what Rav Papa is asking on Rav Zvid. Now this is not really a question. Rav Zvid taka holds true. That is what Rav Papa is saying is taka true. When these trees are going to dry up, so the Baal Hilonis is going to have to take away his trees. But Rav Papa apparently held that it's not mistaver. That the person buys trees, he didn't buy trees with the thought that when these trees are going to dry up, I'm going to have to leave and I won't have the right to have trees here. So Rav Papa therefore disagrees with this. This is the Rashbam's pshat in the Gemara. Taisvis, however, brings another pshat that Rav Papa actually meant to ask, literally, as it sounds like from the words of the Gemara, that the Bala Karka could say to the Bala Ilonis that even while the tree is still growing and it's producing fruits, right now, take your trees away from here and leave. I got the karka and the entire karka is mine, and you don't have any rights to keep your trees here to take nourishment from my ground. Take your trees, uproot them, and plant them somewhere else. You just bought the trees. And that's how Taisva starts. There's a discussion over here, but those are the 2 pshatim in the Gemara. So Elam Rav Papa. Rav Papa says the halach in such a case is different. Again, we're talking about 2 buyers. One bought the karka, the other bought the trees. So Rav Papa says Zeh Kana Ilonis. The one that bought the trees, so he gets the trees, and v'chatzi karka, and he also gets half of the field. And v'zeh kana chatzi karka, the one that bought the karka itself, the ground itself, he only gets half of the field. The Rashbam has 2 pshatim here. When the Gemara says chatzi karka, first the Rashbam says that lav dafke means that we split the karka literally half and half. What the Gemara means to say is similar to what it says in other places regarding such a case. When a person has trees, he gets the area around the trees that he needs for the trees. But does not lav dafka, not mamash half. But then there's another pshat that Rashbam though says that because we're talking about trees that are spread out equally all over this field, so therefore he does get half of the karka for his trees, and the other one gets other half of the karka for his trees. And we'll see soon in Amud Beis, the Gemara says the svar over here is that the Baal Ilonis, Rav Papa holds, the one that bought the trees, says to the one that bought the karka that when we both bought in this field, you got one part and I got the other part. What I got is similar to what you got, just like you get the karka. And when you get the karka, that's an ownership of a property, which is a piece of real estate that you have forever. and no one can ever take you away from here. When I get trees, I'm not buying a movable item, some kind of metaltalin. I'm buying trees that are planted in this karka. So the trees that I get are also a kinyan that I have forever in this area, that I have the rights to keep my trees here, and even if they dry up, I can replant trees in this area, and I got a certain piece of real estate, a certain piece of karka as well, just like you. That's because it was two buyers together, we compare them to each other. The nature of the acquisition is the same. That's Rav Papa's svara. The Gemara brings another two cases regarding this. Says the Gemara, Pshita, the halacha will be simple in the following case. Macha karka. A person sold someone a field, and Vishir Yilonis, and he left for himself. He says, I'm selling you this field, but the trees here, I leave for myself. So the seller is keeping the trees, lefana, for himself. So now, Yeshloi karka. So the seller has karka that he should be able to use his trees, and he should be able to replant. If these trees dry up, he should be able to replant in that area. The seller, when he keeps the trees for himself, he didn't just mean to keep his trees for himself, and then when they dry up, he's going to have to leave, or he can't have any area of karka around the trees for what he needs for the roots of the trees and for using the trees. He meant to keep a piece of karka for himself in such a case. Now, the Gemara says that there's a similar kind of case where a person is selling, where there's actually a machlokes tanaim about this. There's a machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim about this. So now, what's this case? So the Shbam here brings the case where there's a machlokes about this. Va'afilu Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara says. Again, let's see the first words of the Gemara. Va'afilu Rabbi Akiva the Omar. Moicher ba'ayin yafa moicher. Rabbi Akiva says when a person sells, he's selling generously. He's selling with a good eye. And now what this is referring to is a person that sold a house or a field, and inside that property there is a pit that's used whether to store water or whatever the pit is used for. And when you sold, you didn't sell the pit. The pit the seller keeps for himself. So what's the halacha in that case? Rabbi Akiva says that if the seller that kept the pit for himself wants to have a way to get to that pit, he's going to have to buy that separately from the buyer that now owns this entire field or this entire house. Because when you sold, what you sold is generous. You sold it completely, and you don't leave anything for yourself besides that actual pit that's yours. You're gonna have to figure out how to get there. You're gonna have to pay for him in order to be able to get to your pit. That's the shit of Rabbi Akiva. Again, Rabbi Akiva says, "Moicher ba'ayin yafa moicher." When you sell, you're selling everything with a good eye, generously, and we assume that you meant to sell it all. And besides that pit that you said you're keeping for yourself, and you're gonna have to buy away for yourself. So over here, why don't we say a similar thing? You're selling this person this karka, and you're just keeping the trees for yourself. So now, if this person wants to have karka that he needs for his trees, for the roots of his trees, for working around his trees, maybe you should have to pay now your buyer to get that karka for yourself. So as a Gemara, it's not the same thing. Hanamili, when did Rabbi Akiva say what he said? Gabi barvidus. That's only by a pit or something similar to a pit where you store things in it. Because over there, the karka that's around the pit is the pit doesn't take anything, doesn't need the karka at all. The pit doesn't take any nourishment from the ground. The pit is a separate thing. The pit is a separate thing, a separate area that's inside this field. The field belongs to the buyer, and the buyer could use the field all the way up to the edges of the pit, mamish. It's totally his, and the pit is a separate area for itself. So if you're leaving that out, so Rabbi Akiva says you only left that pit out, but not anything else. But when it comes to trees, the nature of trees is that they take nourishment. You have the roots that take nourishment from the ground. So obviously, shiyur ishaya. When the seller is saying that I'm selling you the whole piece of property, but not the trees, he obviously meant to keep for himself the ground that he needs for his trees. Because if not, he would tell him, the buyer would tell him, uproot your trees and leave from here. When they dry up, as we learned before, the Ashbamir says, he would be able to tell the seller, when your trees dry up, leave from here. So over here, in this case, where the trees obviously need karka to take the nourishment from, it's clear that he meant to leave for himself a piece of karka for his trees that he wanted to keep for himself. How about if the case is in the opposite? If a person sells trees, and he's keeping the actual property for himself, what's going to be a halacha in this case? So according to the Rashbam, what this case is talking about is when a person sold only 2 trees. So as I mentioned before, there's a difference if a person is selling 3 trees and more than 3, or less than 3, selling 2 or less. If you sell 3 trees and more, so then we say that it's automatic understanding that part of the sale of the trees, even if you're just selling trees, along with it you get a piece of karka around for using for what you need for your trees. But when you sell 2 or less, so in such a case, the Mishnah says that the halacha is that you just get your trees and not more than that. Okay, so over here, this case, according to the Rashbam, the person sold 2 trees and he's leaving the karka for himself. So the Gemara says, Plukta de Rabbi Akiva v'Rabbanon. So this is going to be a machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanon. What happens regarding karka? Do you get any of the karka as well? Rabbi Akiva that says that when a person sells, he sells generously with a good eye. Isle. So then this buyer that bought these 2 trees is going to have also the space that he needs for these trees. And even when these 2 trees are going to die, he's going to be able to plant another 2 trees in their place because it was sold to him generously that he has the space of that karka to use to plant even again. The Rabbanon, however, the Rabbanon that say, this is going back also to the previous case that I mentioned before, when a person sells a property and he left out the pits for himself, and there the Rabbanon say that a moicher ba'ayin ra moicher. When a person sells, he's selling not with a generous eye. Adarab, he's selling and he wants to keep for himself. The seller wants to keep for himself as much as he needs. So over here as well, I say that if you sold 2 trees and you're keeping the property for yourself, so then the buyer only has those 2 trees, but he gets no property around it for himself. If these 2 trees die, that is, then that's it. It's over. He doesn't have anything else. This is the Rashbam's Pshari and the Gemara. Taisus disagrees. Taisus says that this Gemara is talking about when he sold 3 trees, and it's 3 trees in a small piece of karka. Okay, Taisus says a different pshat, but this is the Rashbam's pshat. So now the Gemara explains that over here, this case, when you have a person that's selling only the trees and keeping the karka for himself, and we're saying that this is a machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanon, this case is different than the case that we had on Amar Aleph, where there was a machlokes between Rav Zvid and Rav Papa. So again, the case on Amar Aleph was where you have 2 buyers. The person is selling everything, but it's 2 buyers. One is buying a karka, and one is buying the trees. And over there was a machlokes between Rav Zvid and Rav Papa. Rav Zvid said that the Balei Elonis gets only the trees, and when his trees dies, he has to take him away, and the balakarka gets totally the karka. And Rav Papa said, no, the balakarka gets a portion of the karka, and the one that gets the trees gets the trees plus a piece of karka around it that he needs for his trees. So the Gemara now wants to explain what's the difference between what Rav Zvid and Rav Papa argued about, and what we're saying here, Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan argue about. It seems like basically the same thing. Should we say that Rav Zvid and Rav Papa are arguing the same machlokes as Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan? Here as well, there's a buyer and a seller. It's not 2 buyers, but there's a buyer and a seller, and the seller is keeping the karka for himself, and the buyer is getting just the trees, and the shaila over here is the same shaila. Does the buyer get just the trees, or does he get the trees and a piece of karka as well? So the Gemara here wants to clarify that the machlokes of Rav Zvid and Rav Papa is not the same machlokes that we're saying in this case between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan. So the Gemara explains as follows. Rabbi Akiva Islay, in this case over here, regarding a case where you have 1 seller and 1 buyer, and he's selling the trees and he's keeping the property for himself. And Rabbi Akiva says that the buyer gets a piece of property as well. Now, even Rav Zvid would agree to this. The Amma Einloi, on Amar Aleph, Rav Zvid said in a case of 2 buyers, then the buyer of the tree does not get any piece of property. But over here, Rav Zvid would agree to Rabbi Akiva. In a case of a seller and a buyer, he would agree that the buyer does get a piece of the property around it. Why? Because Hani Mili, when did Rav Zvid say that the one that gets the trees gets no property at all? That's only if it's 2 buyers. Why is that? Because the Amalei, because when it's 2 buyers, the one that bought the property says to the one that bought the trees, just like I have no percent of the trees that you bought, so too you are the same as me, and you have 0% in the karka. So by 2 buyers, Rav Zvid held that you split it 100%, he gets the properties and he gets the trees. But when it's a buyer and a seller, over here there's a different svara. Over here the svara is that a person that's selling, he sells ba'ayin yofe, and he's selling trees in a way that it makes sense that this person should be able to use these trees properly. He sold with generosity, he sold with a good eye. So Rav Zvid could agree to Rav Akiva in this case. Now, on the other hand, Rav Papa before said when you have two buyers, that even the buyer of the tree does get a percent in the karka. So the Gemara says now, Rabbanon, over here in this case, when you have just a buyer and a seller, and the seller is keeping the karka for himself. So the Rabbanon says, Leslie, that the buyer does not get any portion of the property at all. The buyer just gets the trees, and the seller keeps the karka. Even Rav Papa that said on Amar Aleph, by two buyers, that over there, the buyer of the trees does get a percent in the karka, that's only by two buyers. Because over there, the svada is the Amalei, the buyer of the trees can say, just like you bought the property and you get with a good eye, meaning that you get a piece of property that you have forever as a piece of real estate. So too, we were sort of partners in buying in this field, and I bought my trees together with you, and it's understood that my acquisition of the trees are similar in nature to the acquisition that you're buying in the karka, that I also have a portion in these trees forever, that if these trees dry up, I can plant there again. When it comes to a seller and a buyer, when the seller is keeping the karka for himself, he means to keep the karka totally for himself, and he's just selling the trees as long as these trees are going to live. When these trees die, then he has no sale, then he has nothing over here at all. So therefore, these two arguments, the Rav Zvid and Rav Papa and Rav Akiva and the Rabbanan, are two different cases, and they're not dependent one on another. Okay, now the Gemara goes back to the halacha that we were talking about before regarding being machzik in trees in a karka. Amri Nerdoi. Nerdoi said, when you have an orchard, you have trees planted. Achlan ritzufin, if a person is eating from someone's property and he wants to establish a chazakah for eating and being there 3 years, and he eats ritzufin. Ritzufin means that the trees are planted in this area very, very densely. More than what it's supposed to be, right? As we have before mentioned, that you have 10 trees usually that are spread out within a saw, which is 50 by 50 amas. But over here, it was planted closer more than that. Ein lechazakeh. If you use this property in this time in planting trees so closely tight together, it's not a chazakeh, because this is not the way people use a property. When you see a person using a property this way, it actually looks like he's a Gana. The reason why he's planting it so tightly together is because he just wants to chaparayim and use as much as he can, because it's not his. If it would be his property, he wouldn't use it this way. The Rashbam furthermore says that usually when do you have trees that are planted so close to each other? When you have an area, I think it's called a nursery, where you plant trees, and then after they begin growing a little bit, then you uproot them, and then you plant them in other areas. So the fact that you planted them so close together here, it means you're not planning on keeping them this way. You're going to uproot them. You're going to take it away from here. So therefore, this is not a chazakah. So Rav asks on this, Elamayata. If that's the case regarding trees that are planted very close together, Hai Mesha da Aspasta B'mai Kanilo. When you have aspasta that's planted, which is Gemara brought before, this aspasta is used as animal feed, and this is sprouts that are planted very, very close together. So how are you going to be kind of this? If you're telling me that when something is planted too close together, then there's no chazakah, so how can you establish a chazakah in a field with aspasta? So the Rashbam here says that this question is really not a strong question at all, because by trees, it's not usually planted together. You need space in order for the roots of the trees and to work with the trees to be spread out. By the aspasta, this is the way it's done. Aspasta is planted very closely together. That's the derech. So what's the comparison from the aspasta to the trees? So Rashbam says the question of Rava is not really a question. It's just that Rava is just bringing an example because Rava disagreed with the concept. Rava held that even by trees, although it's not mamash 100% the derech, but if you're planting trees in someone's property and you're eating from it, even if it's very close together, it still will be a chazakah. That's it. So his main point is he wanted to argue with the statement that Nerdoi said. So therefore Rava said, if we would say a halacha about these trees that are very close together, I can say as follows. Machran ritzufin ein loy karka. That in a case where you sell somebody trees in a property and you're just selling him the trees, you didn't tell him you're selling him the ground at all. You're just selling him the trees. If these trees are very close together, so then he gets no karka at all. Even though, as mentioned before, the halacha is when you sell 3 trees, automatically the one that bought the trees gets an area of the karka for his trees. But if they're very close together, he doesn't get any karka. Why not? Like as I mentioned before, because when you sell someone trees that are planted so close together, it's clear that what you're selling him is these trees that are here just temporarily, and they're like in a nursery, and then they're going to be taken out and to go somewhere else. So therefore, he has no karka here at all. That's the halacha that Nerdoi said according to Rava, but not regarding chazaka, only regarding a sale, regarding the question of whether you have a piece of karka here. Rab Zayda says ketanoi. The halacha that Rava said will be based on the machlokes tanoim. Why? Because the Mishnah says kerem shehu natua apoches marbamas. When you have a vineyard, that the rows of the vineyard are planted in such a way that there's less of a space of 4 amas between one row and another. So Rab Shimon Oimer eine kerem. Rab Shimon says because it's planted so close together, you don't look at this as a kerem, as a vineyard. You look at each vine as a separate single vine for itself. Now the significance of this is for the halacha of klayim. By klayim, the halacha is when you have a single vine that's planted and you want to then plant vegetables, so you can't have klayim, the mixture between them, you have to distance 3 tfachim from a single vine to the vegetables that you plant. But if you have a kerem, if you have a whole entire vineyard over there, you have to distance much more. You have to distance 4 amas. So over here, what the Tanakam is saying is, because this vineyard is not planted like a regular vineyard, it's planted very close together, so therefore, it doesn't have the halacha of a vineyard. It has the halacha of like a single vine, and therefore you only have to distance 3 tfachim from it when you want to plant vegetables, not 4 amas. Rab Shimon, so again, here regarding this case, Rab Shimon is the one that says, Einoi kerem, that because it's planted so close together, so therefore it doesn't have the status of a vineyard, it just has the status of a single vine. The Chachamim, however, the Chachamim disagree, and Chachamim say, Harezu kerem, it is considered to be a vineyard. V'rayin esayim tzayim ki'ilu einon. And even though there are rows here of this vineyard that are so tight together, and therefore it really is not planted properly as a regular vineyard, but the middle row that shouldn't have been there, because you need that space between one vine and another, we consider it as if that middle row that's planted there is not there, and therefore it is considered to be like a regular vineyard. Okay, so therefore it comes out that what the halacha that Rav said, when you have trees that are planted very close together, that we consider this to be trees that are not a regular orchard because it's too tight together, is only based on what Rab Shimon said. Rab Shimon said the same thing regarding a vineyard. When you have a vineyard that's planted very close together, it does not have the halacha of a vineyard. Lagabi Klein, that's like one vine and you can plant the vegetables pretty close to it. Only you have to distance 3 tfachim. But according to the Chachamim, even if it's very close together, we consider it as if you took out the middle row and it will have the halacha of a vineyard where you have to distance 4 amas from it. And the same thing regarding selling property with trees, even though they're very close together, we ignore the trees. Some trees you take out, but the others you leave there, and therefore the buyer that bought these trees will get the piece of karka for his trees as well.